My father's toast started with a joke about my failed lemonade stand when I was 9, and it ended, 40 seconds later, with him telling 60 guests that I would never amount to anything. I was standing by the dessert table holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically because I thought tonight would feel like a celebration. It was his retirement party. 31 years at the same engineering firm, and the whole extended family, half his old coworkers, and most of the neighborhood had come out to honor him. I had paid for the venue. I hadn't told anyone that part, because that wasn't the kind of thing you announced at your own father's party. You just did it, quietly, the way I had done most things for him my whole life. Welcome back to Calm Hour Stories. I'm Renee, 38, and this is the night my father stood in front of 60 people and told them I was the family disappointment, without knowing that the man sitting 3 tables back, smiling politely into his wine glass, was the one person in that room who actually held his future in his hands. If you've ever built something real while the people who raised you kept waiting for you to fail, stay with me to the end. Drop a comment and subscribe, because what happened next is the part nobody saw coming, including me. My father is not a cruel man, not in the obvious way. He never raised a hand to anyone. He raised his voice exactly twice in my childhood that I can remember, and both times it was about grades. What he had instead of cruelty was a kind of permanent disappointment that lived behind his eyes whenever he looked at me, like he was always doing a calculation and the number never came out right. My brother Caleb became an engineer, like him. I became, in his words, the one who plays at running a company. That was the phrase he used at Thanksgiving the year I left my stable corporate job to co-found a logistics software company with a man named Adrian Cho, someone I'd met at a conference and trusted within the first hour of talking to him, the way you sometimes trust people for reasons you can't fully explain until years later when they prove you right. My father thought I was being reckless. He told me, calmly, the way he told me everything, that I was throwing away a good job for a fantasy, that companies like mine failed in their first 18 months 90% of the time, and that he hoped I had a plan for when it collapsed. He wasn't trying to be unkind. He believed he was protecting me from disappointment by getting there first. That was always his logic. If he doubted me loudly enough and early enough, the eventual failure would hurt less. The company did not fail. It took 4 brutal years, 2 near bankruptcies, 1 investor who tried to push Adrian and me out of our own board, and more nights than I can count where I sat at my kitchen table doing math that made my stomach hurt. But by year 5 we were profitable, and by year 7 we had 40 employees and a logistics platform used by mid-sized shipping companies across 3 states. I never made a big announcement to my family. I told my mother the broad strokes when she asked. I never corrected my father when he introduced me at gatherings as someone who does something with computers. I had stopped expecting him to update his opinion of me. I had simply built a life next to his disapproval instead of inside it. Adrian became more than a business partner over those years. He became the person who actually knew what my work cost me, because he had paid the same price beside me. He had a steady, unshowy way of being decent. He remembered employees' kids' names. He sent flowers to my mother the year she had her hip surgery, without me asking. When I told him my father was retiring and the family was throwing a party, I half-joked that he should come, since he'd basically lived through the company's entire existence with me. He said he'd be honored. I didn't think twice about it. I had no idea that night would end with him quietly holding a piece of paper that had my father's name on it. The venue was a banquet hall my father had always admired from the outside, the kind with chandeliers and a small stage for toasts, the kind of place his generation associated with having finally arrived. I'd booked it 8 months in advance and paid the deposit out of my own account without telling him, because I knew he would have argued about the cost, the way he argued about most costs that weren't his idea. My mother knew. She'd hugged me hard when I told her, the kind of hug that said more than she was able to say out loud in our family, where feelings were filed away instead of spoken. I arrived early to check on the catering, the way I check on everything, because that is who I am. I am the one who checks. I had been the one who checked since I was 12 years old and learned that if I didn't keep track of things, nobody else would, And the things that didn't get tracked tended to fall apart quietly until they were unfixable. I checked the seating chart twice. I checked that my father's favorite scotch was at the bar. I checked that the slideshow of his career photos was loaded correctly onto the projector. I did not check whether he had something planned for the microphone beyond the standard retirement remarks, because it never occurred to me that I needed to. By 7, the room was full. Aunts and uncles I hadn't seen in years. Old co-workers from the firm, some of them men my father had mentored decades earlier, who came up to me one by one to say how proud he must be, how lucky he was to have a daughter who pulled off something like this. I smiled and thanked them and felt, underneath the smiling, the particular ache of being praised for something my own father had never once acknowledged out loud. Adrian found me near the bar around 7:30, looking sharp in a navy suit, holding a glass of something amber. He squeezed my shoulder and told me the room looked beautiful, that I'd done an incredible job, and for a second I let myself feel proud of the night instead of anxious about it. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the kind of easy, low-stakes conversation you have with someone who has already seen you at your worst and stayed anyway. Then the DJ tapped the microphone, and the room began to quiet, because it was time for the toasts, and my father was already making his way toward the small stage with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once doubted that a room would listen to him. I want you to remember this moment, the version of me standing by the dessert table with an untouched glass of champagne, because in about 90 seconds, that version of me was going to hear something that would split my evening, and eventually my whole understanding of my family, cleanly in half. My father took the microphone the way he took most things in life, like it had been waiting for him. He thanked the room for coming. He thanked my mother for 38 years of patience, which got a warm laugh. He talked about the early days at the firm, the projects he was proudest of, the bridge inspection system he'd helped design that was still in use across 2 counties. He was good at this. He had always been good at commanding a room, at making people feel like they were part of something important just by being invited to hear about it. I watched him glow under the small stage lights and felt, despite everything, a flicker of the old hope. Maybe tonight he says something kind. Maybe tonight, in front of everyone, he finally says he's proud of me too. Then he turned, almost as an afterthought, toward where I was standing, and he smiled the particular smile he used when he thought he was being charming. He said he wanted to tell a story about his kids. He told the lemonade stand story first, the one I'd heard 100 times, about how I'd set up a stand at age 9 and given away free lemonade to anyone who looked thirsty, losing every penny of the seed money my mother had fronted me. The room laughed. I laughed too, because it was, on its own, a harmless childhood story, the kind every family has. But he didn't stop there. He said it with the easy confidence of a man finishing a thought he'd clearly had many times before, just never out loud in front of 60 people. He said that story had always told him everything he needed to know, that some people are built for numbers and some people are built to give things away, and he'd always known which one I was. He said he loved me, but he'd stopped waiting a long time ago for me to amount to anything, and he'd made peace with that, the way you make peace with weather. He said it lightly, almost fondly, like he was paying me a strange kind of compliment by finally being honest. The room didn't laugh this time. The room went very, very quiet, the specific quiet of 60 people realizing in real time that they'd just watched something they weren't supposed to see. I have replayed that quiet more times than I can count. It wasn't outrage. Outrage would have been easier to sit inside. It was the particular held breath of people deciding, in real time, whether to look at me or look away, and most of them chose to look away, because looking at me would have meant acknowledging what had just happened, and nobody wanted to be the one who acknowledged it first. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My brother Caleb, sitting near the front, looked down at his plate like it had suddenly become very interesting. Somewhere near the back, I heard a single, badly timed chuckle from someone who hadn't caught the shift in the room, and then silence swallowed even that. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, the way I want to be honest about everything in this story, because if I tell it like I was strong the whole way through, you won't believe the rest, and you shouldn't. What I felt instead was a strange, floating calm, the kind that arrives sometimes after a shock so clean it skips past the part where you feel anything at all and lands you directly in stillness. I set my champagne glass down on the dessert table very carefully, the same way I would, days later, set down 2 pieces of paper on a different table, in a moment that would feel, looking back, like an answer to this one. My father didn't seem to register what he'd done. He raised his glass, said something about being grateful for his family exactly as they were, and the room applauded, thin and uncertain, the kind of applause that exists mostly to give people something to do with their hands. He stepped down from the stage, accepted a hand on the shoulder from an old coworker, and made his way toward the bar, satisfied, the way a man is satisfied after he's said something he's been holding for years and finally let it out. I stood very still by the dessert table, and the first person to reach me was not my mother, and it was not Caleb. It was Adrian. He didn't say anything performative. He didn't tell me my father was wrong, didn't launch into a defense, because Adrian has never been the kind of man who fills silence just to be comfortable. He simply stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the solidness of him, and said quietly, "Do you want to leave, or do you want to stay and let them watch you not fall apart?" It was, somehow, exactly the right question. I told him I wanted to stay. He nodded once, like that was the answer he expected, and got me a glass of water instead of more champagne, because he is the kind of person who notices things like that. I spent the rest of the party doing what I have always done at family events where something has gone wrong and nobody is going to address it directly. I performed normalcy. I talked to my father's old coworkers about the bridge inspection project. I let my aunt tell me, for the 3rd time that year, about her knee surgery. I smiled at the slideshow when his retirement photos came up on the screen, even the one from 20 years ago where I am sitting on his shoulders at a company picnic, his hand wrapped around my ankle, both of us laughing at something neither of us can probably remember now. My mother found me near the coat check around 10, her eyes red-rimmed in the way she always tries to hide and never quite manages. She didn't apologize for him, because that has never been her role in this family, but she squeezed my hand hard, twice, the way she used to when I was small and scared of something I couldn't name. She said, "He doesn't mean it the way it sounded," and I told her I knew, because I did know, and somehow that made it worse instead of better. A man who doesn't mean to wound you and does it anyway in front of 60 people has still wounded you. Intention is not armor. It just changes who you're allowed to be angry at. Adrian drove me home that night, because I had arrived early with the caterers and hadn't thought to arrange my own way back. We didn't talk much in the car. Somewhere around the 2nd mile, with the city lights sliding past the window, he said something I didn't fully understand the weight of until 3 days later. He said, almost to himself, looking at the road, "I think I might know your parents' street." I told him that was a strange thing to say, and he said it was nothing, that it had just clicked into place looking at the address on the invitation, that he'd dealt with a property on that block recently through the fund. I didn't ask what he meant by the fund. I had no idea, that night, that the question I didn't ask was about to become the center of everything. To understand why Adrian's comment mattered, you need to understand what Adrian actually did outside of running our company with me, something I knew about only in the loosest, most abstract way. Adrian had grown up with almost nothing, in a way I never had, despite my father's certainty that I was the soft one in our family. His mother had lost their house to foreclosure when he was 14, and he'd watched it happen slowly, over 18 months, with the kind of helpless clarity that only a teenager who understands exactly what is happening but has no power to stop it can have. He told me about it once, years ago, late one night during the company's worst quarter, when we were both certain we were about to lose everything we'd built and needed, for some reason, to talk about the worst things that had already happened to us instead of the thing that might happen next. He had built, alongside our software company, a small side investment fund with 2 college friends, the kind of fund that bought distressed debt and underperforming mortgage notes from regional banks at a discount, then worked with homeowners to restructure terms instead of foreclosing, because Adrian had decided a long time ago that if he was ever in a position to be the bank, he was not going to be the bank that took his mother's house. It wasn't charity. It made money, real money, the kind that came from buying notes for 60 cents on the dollar and collecting at terms both sides could live with. But it ran on a principle, and the principle was personal in a way most financial structures aren't. I knew the fund existed the way you know a friend has a hobby you've never seen up close. I didn't know the names of the banks they bought from. I certainly didn't know that 6 weeks before my father's retirement party, the fund had purchased a small bundle of underperforming mortgage notes from a regional bank that had been quietly offloading risk after a rough earnings quarter, and that buried inside that bundle, among notes from 4 different states, was a fixed-rate mortgage on a brick split-level house on Maple Hollow Drive, a house I had grown up in, a house my parents had refinanced 11 years earlier when my father's firm went through a round of layoffs that he had never fully recovered from financially, even after going back to work, even after 31 years. Adrian called me 2 days after the party, not about the company, which was unusual enough that I knew before he said a word that something had shifted. He asked if he could come by instead of talking on the phone, and I said yes, because by then I had already started turning over his comment in the car, the address, the fund, the careful way he'd said nothing when it clearly wasn't nothing. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same kind of table where I do all my hardest thinking, and he told me directly, the way he tells me everything, without performance and without softening it more than the facts required. He said the fund had closed on a note package the prior month. He said he hadn't looked closely at the individual loans himself. That was usually his partner Devin's job, the due diligence and servicing side. He said Devin had flagged one of the addresses to him 2 days ago, after the party, because Devin remembered me mentioning my parents lived in the area once, years back, in an offhand way during a dinner none of us thought twice about at the time. Devin had pulled the file out of curiosity and found my father's name on it. I sat very still while Adrian told me this, the same stillness I'd had at the dessert table 3 days earlier, because some part of me already understood that this was a piece of information capable of changing the shape of everything that came after it, and I wanted to receive it carefully, the way you'd hold something fragile you weren't sure yet whether you wanted. My father's mortgage. The house I grew up in. Sitting, now, inside a fund my own business partner partly owned. Adrian was very clear about one thing before I asked a single question. He told me the fund had no plans to do anything differently because of who the borrower was. The note would be serviced exactly as it would have been serviced for any homeowner in the bundle, with the same restructuring offers, the same patience, the same refusal to foreclose unless every other option had failed. He said he wasn't telling me this to give me leverage over my family. He was telling me because he believed, after watching me stand frozen by a dessert table while my father told a room of 60 people I would never amount to anything, that I deserved to know the truth of the situation I was actually standing inside, instead of finding out by accident later and feeling betrayed that he'd kept it from me. I asked him the obvious question, the one anyone would ask. Was my father behind on payments? Adrian hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because I could see him weighing whether telling me crossed some line he held for himself, a line about privacy and information he had access to only because of his work. He finally said yes, quietly. 4 months behind, with a notice of default that had already gone out from the bank before the sale, the kind of notice that starts a clock most homeowners don't fully understand is ticking until it's almost out of time. I sat with that for a long moment. My father, who had stood on a small stage 3 nights earlier and told a room full of people that I would never amount to anything, who had spent 38 years building a reputation as the responsible one, the provider, the man whose children should have been grateful just to be associated with his name, was 4 months behind on his mortgage and hadn't told a single person in our family. Not my mother, apparently, based on the careful, confused way she'd talked about tightening the budget a little the last time I'd visited. Not Caleb. Nobody. I felt something complicated move through me, something that wasn't triumph, though I won't pretend a small, ugly part of it wasn't satisfaction, the kind I'm not proud of but won't lie about either. Mostly what I felt was the same cold clarity I'd felt at the dessert table, the sense of a ledger opening itself in my mind without my permission. On one side, 38 years of being told, in 100 small ways and one enormous public one, that I was the disappointment, the soft one, the one who'd never amount to anything. On the other side, a man 4 months from losing the house he raised me in, who had no idea that the one person who might actually be able to help him quietly was sitting at her own kitchen table, holding the knowledge like a weight she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure yet what to do with. I asked Adrian what would happen if nothing changed. He told me plainly. The fund would proceed through the standard process, offer a restructuring plan first, as they always did, but if my father didn't respond or couldn't make even the adjusted payments, foreclosure proceedings would begin within 90 days, the way they would for anyone in the bundle. There was no special protection coming from anywhere, including from Adrian, unless someone decided to create one. I asked him if he thought I should. He looked at me for a long moment, and said something I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "I'm not going to tell you what your father deserves. I only know what I'd have wanted someone to do for my mother, and I know it has nothing to do with what she deserved either." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed running the math the way I run every hard decision, breaking it down into its smallest honest pieces, because emotion alone has never been a tool I trust to land me somewhere solid. The first piece was simple. My father was in real, serious financial trouble, the kind that ends with a moving truck and a locksmith if it isn't addressed, and he hadn't told anyone in the family, which meant he was either too proud or too frightened to ask for help, and knowing him, it was almost certainly both at once. The second piece was less simple. I now possessed information that gave me a kind of power over him that no child should ever hold over a parent, and I had not asked for it, and I did not particularly want it, and yet here it was, sitting in my chest like a coin I couldn't put down. The third piece was the hardest, and it took me until almost 3 in the morning to even let myself think it clearly. I wanted, somewhere underneath all the complicated tenderness I still felt for him, to use this. Not cruelly. Not the way he had used a microphone and 60 witnesses to tell me what he thought I was worth. But I wanted, at minimum, for him to know that the daughter he'd called a disappointment in front of his entire social circle was the reason his house hadn't disappeared out from under him 3 months later. I wanted the math to be visible to him, the way it had never been visible at that party, where he'd stood in the spotlight he loved most and decided, almost lazily, to spend my dignity to make a joke land. I didn't act on any of it the next morning, because I have learned, the hard way, across years of building a company with people who wanted me to move fast on every instinct, that the decisions that matter should never be made on the night you're still bleeding from them. I went to work. I sat through 2 unremarkable client calls. I let 3 days pass with nothing more than ordinary text messages between me and my mother, the kind that mentioned dinner plans and nothing real. I was waiting, though I couldn't have told you exactly for what, until the 4th day, when my mother called me crying, and the waiting ended. She didn't tell me everything at first. She told me my father had been stressed about money, the kind of euphemism our family specialized in, the kind that lets everyone avoid the real noun underneath it. I asked careful questions, the way I question vendors when something in a contract doesn't add up, gentle but precise, until she finally said the word herself, the word I'd already known for 4 days and had been carrying around like a stone in my coat pocket. Foreclosure. She said it like it was something shameful she'd done personally, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even at the worst moments of my childhood. She said they'd gotten a letter. She said my father hadn't told her how bad it had gotten until the letter arrived, that he'd been quietly skipping payments and hoping something would fix itself before anyone had to know, the way he handled almost every hard thing in his life, by waiting for it to resolve on its own and being disappointed when it never did. I asked her if Dad knew she was telling me. She said no, that he would be furious if he found out, that he'd specifically told her not to tell Caleb or me, because, in her words, repeating something I could tell cost her to say out loud, he didn't want us to think less of him than we already did. I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up. He didn't want us to think less of him than we already did. My father, 3 nights after standing in front of 60 people to tell them I would never amount to anything, was afraid of what I would think of him if he failed at something. The 2 facts sat side by side in my mind, ugly and almost funny in their unfairness, the way only family math can be. I called Adrian that evening and told him everything my mother had said. He listened without interrupting, the way he always does, and when I was finished he asked me a simple, direct question. Did I want to do anything, and if so, what? Not what should I do, not what would my father deserve, just the plain, practical question of intent, which is the kind of question Adrian has always been good at asking me when I'm too tangled and feeling to ask it of myself. I told him I didn't want to hand my father a gift wrapped in ribbon. I didn't want to walk into his living room and announce I was saving him, the way he'd announced things my whole childhood, standing tall while everyone else stood smaller. That wasn't justice. That was just trading one performance of power for another, and some part of me, the part still holding on to 38 years of being underestimated, refused to let him be saved by me in a way that let him feel noble about it. What I wanted, I told Adrian, slowly working it out loud for the first time, was something closer to what I'd done at my father's own dinner table once before in a different family, in a story I'd never told him, about a friend's situation years earlier that I'd quietly helped untangle without taking a bow for it. I wanted my father to be offered the restructuring plan the fund offered everyone, fairly, without favoritism, without rescue. And I wanted him to find out, eventually, on his own terms or on mine, exactly whose hands that plan had passed through on its way to him. Not as a gift. As a fact. The same kind of fact I'd laid on a table once before with 2 pieces of paper and a quiet voice. Let the truth do the work my voice never could. Adrian was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that settled the whole plan into place for me. He said the fund's standard restructuring offer was already generous, already exactly what any homeowner in the bundle would receive, current with the bank's original obligations and Devon's careful underwriting. He said the only thing that needed deciding was not whether my father would be treated fairly, because he already would be, but whether I wanted to be the one who eventually told him why the offer had felt, in some way he couldn't name, slightly more patient than he expected. I told him yes. Not yet, but yes. We agreed, that night, that nothing about the restructuring process would change because of who the borrower was, and that I would not interfere with Devon's standard procedures in any way that gave my father special treatment beyond what every other family in that note bundle would receive. The only thing I asked for, the only thing I let myself ask for, was to be told the moment the formal restructuring letter went out, so that I would know exactly when the clock that mattered had started ticking, and exactly how much time I had to decide what, if anything, I was going to say, and when, and to how many people. The letter went out 11 days later, a formal restructuring offer from the fund's servicing arm, the kind of dense legal document that homeowners in crisis often need someone to sit with them and translate line by line. I know this because my mother called me again, this time sounding cautiously hopeful instead of frightened, to tell me a company had reached out with an offer to lower their monthly payment and extend the loan term, giving them a real chance to catch up without losing the house. She didn't know the name of the fund meant anything to me. She read me the company's name over the phone, slowly, the way you read something you don't fully understand but want to get right, and I sat on my side of the call and said, "That sounds like a good offer, Mom," in a voice as steady as I could manage, because it was a good offer, and because I already knew every detail of it before she finished the sentence. My father, predictably, did not want to take it at first. My mother told me, in the careful, second-hand way she relayed almost everything about him, that he'd been suspicious of the offer, convinced there had to be a catch, some predatory fine print designed to take advantage of people in exactly his position. It was, in a strange way, the most honest version of my father I'd encountered in years, a man so certain the world operated on extraction that he couldn't recognize fairness when it was placed directly in front of him. My mother had to talk him into letting their lawyer review it, the same overworked family attorney who'd handled their will and nothing more complicated in 15 years. The lawyer came back a week later and told them, in his own words, that this was about as clean and reasonable a restructuring offer as he'd ever seen, that whoever had structured it clearly wasn't trying to squeeze them. My father signed it. My mother told me this on a Tuesday, almost giddy with relief, the kind of relief that comes after weeks of carrying something alone and finally being allowed to put it down even part way. She said they'd be able to keep the house. She said it twice, like she needed to hear herself say it to believe it. I told her I was glad, and I meant it more completely than she could have known, because somewhere underneath the complicated tangle of everything else I was feeling, I was glad, genuinely, that the house I'd grown up in, the house with the lemonade stand driveway and the company picnic photo and 38 years of my mother's quiet patience, wasn't going to be taken from either of them. But gladness was not the only thing I felt, and I want to be honest about that the way I've tried to be honest about everything else, because the gladness sat right alongside something harder and more stubborn that refused to dissolve just because the crisis had passed. My father had been saved, quietly, by a structure that existed because a 14-year-old boy named Adrian Cho had once watched his own mother lose everything and decided, years later, that he would never be the version of power that did that to someone else. My father had been saved, in part, because his daughter had built a life solid enough to be standing in the room when the information about his crisis surfaced, a daughter he'd told a room full of 60 people would never amount to anything. He didn't know any of that. He believed, as far as I could tell, that some anonymous, reasonably run company had simply happened to be merciful, the way you believe in luck instead of mechanisms when you don't ask too many questions about how good fortune actually arrives. I sat with the question of whether to tell him for almost 3 weeks. I want to be clear that this was not a strategic delay, not a chess move. I genuinely did not know, for most of that time, whether telling him served anything other than my own need to be seen, and I had spent enough of my adult life trying to untangle my actual values from my old wounds to know that the two don't always point in the same direction. There were nights I decided I would never tell him, that I would simply let the house stay theirs and let the knowledge live quietly in me, a private fact that changed nothing about how he saw me but changed everything about how I understood the actual shape of the power between us. There were other nights I knew, with total certainty, that I could not let this go unspoken, that some part of the wound from that banquet hall would never fully close unless the truth was placed, once, directly in front of him, the way I'd once placed 2 pieces of paper on a different table in a story I told you the broad strokes of once before, in a life that wasn't this one but rhymed with it closely enough that the same lesson applied. What finally tipped me toward telling him wasn't anger. It was something my mother said, almost in passing, during one of our calls in that 3-week stretch. She mentioned that my father had started telling people, casually, at church and around the neighborhood, about the lucky break they'd gotten with the mortgage company, framing it, the way he framed most things, as a story about his own resourcefulness, about how he'd found a way through it, about how he'd always landed on his feet. He was building a narrative, the same way he'd built the narrative at the retirement party, in which he was the steady center of the story and everyone else, including the actual mechanism of his rescue, was incidental. I recognized the pattern instantly, because I had spent 38 years watching him narrate our family in exactly that shape, himself at the center, gravity bending toward him, the rest of us orbiting in whatever role served the story he needed to tell that day. I decided, somewhere in that recognition, that I was not willing to let him keep telling that particular version of this particular story. Not out of cruelty. Out of the same instinct that had made me lay 2 documents on a table once before instead of arguing with my voice. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be placed somewhere a person cannot avoid looking at them. I called my mother and asked if the family was getting together anytime soon, a real gathering, not just the 2 of us on the phone. She told me, almost as if it were fate handing me the exact stage I needed, that they were hosting Easter dinner that year, the first big family gathering since the retirement party, with most of the same relatives who'd been in that banquet hall 5 months earlier. I told her I'd be there. I asked, carefully, if Adrian could come too, framing it as a simple invitation, a partner in my life who'd become important enough to include. She said of course, sounding pleased, with no idea that she had just agreed to let the second half of this story walk through her front door. I told Adrian about Easter dinner the same evening my mother confirmed it, and I watched his face carefully while I explained what I was thinking, because I needed to know, before I asked him for anything, whether this was something he was actually willing to be part of, and not something I was pulling him into out of my own need for an audience. I told him I didn't want him to say anything dramatic, didn't want a confrontation staged like a courtroom scene. I wanted him there as exactly what he was, my business partner, someone my family had met once before, someone who happened, quietly and without performance, to be able to confirm a fact my father needed to hear from someone other than me, because I knew, the way you know things about people you've spent a lifetime studying, that my father would find a way to dismiss it if it came from my mouth alone. He has always had a particular skill for re-narrating anything I say into something smaller than it was. He would not be able to do that as easily with Adrian sitting across the table, calm and unbothered, simply stating a fact. Adrian agreed without hesitation, but he asked me one careful question before he did, the same kind of question he always asks before stepping into something delicate. He asked if I was doing this because I wanted my father to feel small, the way I had felt small in that banquet hall, or because I genuinely believed the truth needed to exist out loud in that family, regardless of how it landed. I sat with the question longer than I expected to, because it deserved a real answer and not a flattering one. I told him both things were probably true, in different proportions on different days, and that I wasn't going to pretend the smaller, uglier part of my motivation wasn't there. But I told him the larger part, the part one trusted more, was simpler than revenge. I had spent 38 years being defined by my father's narrative of me, a narrative built mostly on his own fear and projection rather than anything true about who I actually was. I was not interested in replacing his narrative with a crueler one. I was interested in making sure, once, in front of the people who'd watched him diminish me without objection, that the truth existed in the room at the same time the old story did, so that anyone paying attention could finally see both versions side by side and decide for themselves which one held up. The 2 weeks before Easter passed strangely. My father, according to my mother, was in unusually good spirits, buoyed by the relief of the mortgage situation and the upcoming gathering, which he'd apparently decided to treat as a kind of second retirement celebration, since the first one, in his memory, had gone beautifully. That detail alone told me something important. He genuinely did not register what he'd done to me that night as anything significant. It had not lived in him the way it had lived in me. He remembered the toast as a charming, honest moment between a father and his guests, a bit of self-deprecating family humor that everyone surely understood the spirit of. The gap between his memory of that night and mine was, in its own way, more painful to sit with than the original moment had been, because it meant the wound had been entirely mine to carry, unwitnessed by the person who caused it. I spent those 2 weeks doing what I have always done before anything that matters, the same thing I did before the closing on a sale years earlier in a different chapter of my life, the same thing I do before any hard conversation with stakes I can't fully control. I prepared. Not a speech, exactly, because speeches feel performed and I did not want this to feel like theater, even though I understood, on some level, that anything done in front of relatives at a holiday table inevitably has a theatrical shape whether you intend it or not. What I prepared instead was a kind of internal clarity, a short list of the exact facts I would say if the moment arrived, stripped of all the resentment and justification I could have wrapped around them. I have learned, across years of negotiating with investors and difficult clients, that the facts alone, stated plainly, do more damage to a false narrative than any amount of emotional argument ever could. Emotion gives people something to argue with. Facts just sit there, immovable, until someone is forced to reckon with them. I also spent those weeks deciding what I was not going to do, which felt almost as important as deciding what I was. I was not going to bring documents to the table, the way I once had in another story, because this was not a legal dispute, and there was nothing here that needed a signature or a deed to prove. I was not going to ask Adrian to explain the fund's entire structure or the mechanics of distressed debt purchasing, because that would turn a human moment into a business lecture, and the point was never the mechanism, the point was the fact underneath it. I was not going to wait for my father to bring up the retirement party first, the way some buried part of me had once hoped he might, apologizing unprompted, because 5 months of silence on his end had already answered that question for me. He was never going to bring it up. If anything was going to be said, I was the one who was going to have to say it. The night before Easter, I lay awake again, the way I had the night Adrian first told me about the mortgage, running through every version of how the next day could go. I imagined my father laughing it off, the way he laughed off most things that threatened his version of himself. I imagined my mother crying, caught once again between two people she loved who could not seem to stop hurting each other in slow, complicated ways. I imagined Caleb, who had said nothing at the retirement party, saying nothing again, because that has always been his particular survival strategy in our family, invisibility as armor. I imagined, too, the version where nothing dramatic happened at all, where the day passed in pleasant, ordinary holiday rhythms, ham and conversation and nothing said, and I found, to my own surprise, that I could live with that outcome too. I had already done the part that mattered most to me, weeks earlier, when I'd decided not to let my father's house disappear out of pure unwillingness to be the kind of person who'd let it happen out of spite. Whatever happened at the table the next day would be the second half of the story, but the first half, the part about who I actually was underneath everything my father had decided about me, was already finished, and it had already turned out differently than his speech. Easter dinner was at my parents' house, the same brick split level on Maple Hollow Drive that had nearly disappeared out from under them 5 months earlier, set now with my mother's good china and a ham that filled the kitchen with a smell I associated with almost every important moment of my childhood, good and bad alike. The same extended family that had filled the banquet hall arrived in smaller numbers, the way Easter always draws fewer people than a milestone retirement, but enough of them were there, aunts and uncles and Caleb with his wife and kids, that the table again felt full, again felt like an audience, whether or not that had been anyone's intention. Adrian arrived a little after the others, dressed simply, carrying a bottle of wine and the same unhurried calm he carries into every room he enters. My mother greeted him warmly, genuinely glad to see him, with no idea of the weight he was walking in alongside. My father shook his hand with the particular firm, appraising grip he reserved for men he was deciding whether to respect, and said something about being glad Renee's business partner could join them, a phrase that, even now, still managed to compress everything I'd built down into a footnote attached to someone else's sentence. I let it pass. I had decided, the night before, that I was not going to spend the day collecting small grievances. I was saving my attention for the one that mattered. Dinner began the way our family dinners always began, with my father at the head of the table, holding court, narrating the meal itself as though it were an event worth chronicling. He talked about the ham, about a new grill attachment he'd bought, about a neighbor's dog that kept getting into their trash. It was ordinary, almost soothing in its ordinariness, and for a stretch of nearly 40 minutes I let myself simply be there, eating my mother's cooking, half listening to my niece's story about a school play, feeling, despite everything underneath the surface, something close to peace. It was my father himself who opened the door, the way he so often did without realizing it, by deciding to tell, once again, the story of the mortgage company's lucky break. He told it to my aunt, who hadn't heard it yet, framing it exactly the way my mother had described, himself at the center, his own resourcefulness the engine of the rescue. He said he'd found a company willing to work with him, that he'd talked them into a fair deal, that it had taken some doing but he'd always known how to handle people like that. My mother, beside him, said nothing, though I caught the smallest flicker of something pass across her face, something between discomfort and habit, the particular expression of a woman who has spent decades letting her husband's version of events stand uncorrected because correcting him has never once been worth the cost. I felt Adrian's eyes find mine across the table, not urging me toward anything, simply present, simply there, the way he'd promised to be. I set my fork down. I did not raise my voice, the same way I had not raised my voice once before at a different table, in a story whose shape I had borrowed, almost without meaning to, for this one, because some truths apparently only ever get told the same way, quietly, plainly, with the facts doing the work the voice never could. I said, into the small space after my father finished his sentence, that I was glad he'd been able to keep the house. I said it warmly, and I meant it, and I watched him nod, pleased, accepting the warmth as simple agreement with his version of the story. Then I said the next part, the part one had decided weeks earlier I was finally going to say, the part one had stripped of every ounce of justification I could manage, leaving only the bare fact itself. I said the company that bought the mortgage note wasn't some stranger he'd talked into a deal. I said it was a fund partly owned by Adrian, sitting right there at the table, my business partner of 7 years, and that the restructuring offer he'd received had been the same standard, fair offer given to every homeowner in that note package, nothing special, nothing he'd negotiated, just the ordinary decency the fund extended to everyone, including, as it happened, him. The table went quiet in a way I recognized instantly, the same particular quiet from the banquet hall 5 months earlier, the held breath quiet of people realizing, in real time, that the version of events they'd been comfortably sitting inside had just been rearranged underneath them. My aunt's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Caleb looked up from his plate for the first time all evening. My mother's eyes went, almost involuntarily, to Adrian, then back to me, then to my father, watching his face the way you watch weather change. My father's expression did something I had genuinely never seen it do before, not at the retirement party, not at any family dinner across 38 years. It didn't harden into denial. It didn't flush with anger, the way I'd half expected. It simply went still, the particular stillness of a man doing fast, uncomfortable math, recalculating a story he had told himself and others so many times that he had nearly forgotten it wasn't entirely true. He looked at Adrian directly, and asked, in a voice quieter than I had heard from him in years, whether that was true. Adrian, calm as ever, simply confirmed it, plainly, without embellishment, the way he confirms everything, stating only the facts that were his to state. Yes, the fund had purchased the note package. Yes, the restructuring offer had gone out to every homeowner in the bundle on identical terms. No, nothing had been altered or softened specifically because of who the borrower was. He said it without triumph, without any edge in his voice at all, and somehow that flatness made it land harder than any accusation could have. My father turned back to me then, and for the first time since I could remember, I watched him search for something to say and come up empty. He didn't apologize, not in that moment, not with the whole table watching, because that has never been how he operates, the same way he hadn't apologized in any of the 4 unanswered voicemails he'd never sent. But something in his face cracked open in a way I had never witnessed before, something that looked, for just a second, almost like the version of fear I imagine he must have carried privately through those 4 months of missed payments, the fear he'd been too proud to let any of us see. My mother was the one who broke the silence, not with anger, but with a small, strange laugh that came out before she seemed to mean it to, the kind of laugh that escapes when a person doesn't know what else to do with the size of what they've just understood. She looked at me, then at Adrian, then back at my father, and said, "All this time you've been telling that story about talking them into it," and didn't finish the sentence, because she didn't need to. The unfinished sentence said everything. My aunt, sitting across from her, looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in her green beans, the universal family signal for I am not getting involved in this. I did not say anything else for a long moment. I had decided, lying awake the night before, that once the fact was placed on the table, I was not going to chase it with commentary, the same way I had once slid 2 documents across a different table and let silence do the rest of the work. Facts don't need defending. They only need room to exist. So I sat there, hands folded, and let the table absorb what had just been said, the way you let a stone settle to the bottom of still water instead of stirring it further. It was Caleb, of all people, who spoke next, and it surprised me enough that I actually turned to look at him fully for the first time all evening. He said, quietly, not quite looking at our father, that he remembered the retirement party. He said it like an admission, like something he'd been holding on to without quite knowing what to do with it for 5 months. He said he'd thought about saying something that night, right after the toast, and hadn't, and that he'd felt strange about it ever since, watching me hold the room together while the room pretended nothing had happened. It was the most my brother had said about anything emotional in years, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, hearing it, the particular relief of discovering that a witness existed even when you'd assumed you were entirely alone in a memory. My father did not respond to Caleb. He was still looking at me, and I watched him work through something visibly, the way you watch a man recalculate a number he'd been certain of for years and finding, suddenly, that it doesn't add up the way he thought it did. Finally, he said my name, just my name, nothing else, in a tone I didn't fully recognize, quieter than his retirement party voice, quieter than the voice he used to deliver disappointment dressed as honesty. I waited. I had learned, across 7 years of running a company and 38 years of being his daughter, that silence is sometimes the only thing that gives a person room to say something true instead of something performed. He said he hadn't known. He said it plainly, almost helplessly, the way a man says something when he's run out of better options. He said he hadn't known the company was connected to me, hadn't known any of it, and that he didn't know what to do with knowing it now, sitting at his own table, in front of his own family, On the same kind of occasion where 5 months earlier he had stood up and told everyone I would never amount to anything. He didn't apologize for that night specifically, not yet, not in front of everyone, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him might never fully apologize for it in the direct way I had once imagined wanting. But something in the room had shifted regardless, something structural, the same way a building shifts on its foundation even when no one inside notices the exact moment it happens. I told him, gently, that I hadn't told him to make him feel small. I said it because it was true, and because I needed it to exist in the room alongside the fact I'd just delivered, the same way I'd once told my own mother, in a different story, that I loved her even while telling her the bank was closed. I said I didn't need him to grovel, didn't need a public reversal of everything he'd ever said about me, because honestly, by that point in my life, his opinion of my worth had stopped being the engine that ran me a long time ago. I told him I'd told him because I was tired of watching him build stories where he was always the center of his own rescue, when the truth was that for most of his life, other people, quiet people, overlooked people, had been doing the work of holding things together around him without him ever once noticing. My mother reached over and took his hand at that point, not in a way that excused him, but in the practiced way of a woman who has spent 38 years finding the seam between honesty and survival in this particular marriage. My father didn't pull away from her hand, but he also didn't speak again for a long while, and the dinner continued around the silence the way rivers continue around a stone, slowly finding new paths, conversation picking back up in fragments, my aunt asking my niece about her school play again, grateful for anywhere else to put her attention. Adrian caught my eye once more before dessert, a small, steady look that asked nothing and offered everything, the look of a man checking that I was all right without making a production of checking. I nodded, almost imperceptibly, and he returned to his quiet conversation with Caleb about something unrelated, easing the table back toward normalcy with the same unhurried decency he brings to everything. I want to tell you that my father pulled me aside before I left that night and said something that fixed 38 years in a single sentence, the kind of ending this story would have if it were fiction instead of something that actually happened to me. He didn't. What he did instead, as I was putting my coat on near the door, was touch my shoulder, briefly, the way he used to when I was small and he was teaching me something he didn't have words for, and say, "Thank you for not letting it go further than it had to." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even, strictly, gratitude in the shape I might have wanted. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that he had acknowledged, even obliquely, that I had done something for him on purpose, something that cost me, something he hadn't earned and couldn't fully explain. I told him I knew. I meant it the way I mean most things now, plainly, without performance, the same way I've learned to say almost everything that matters. I drove home that night with Adrian in the passenger seat, the city quiet around us the way it gets after a holiday, streets emptier than usual, most houses already dark. Neither of us said much for the first few miles, the comfortable kind of silence that exists between two people who have already said the important things to each other in private, long before they needed to say anything in public. Somewhere past the halfway point, he asked me how I felt, the same kind of simple, direct question he'd asked me once before, in the car after the retirement party, when he'd asked if I wanted to leave or stay and let them watch me not fall apart. I told him the truth, because I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that the truth is the only thing actually worth saying to the people who have earned the right to hear it. I told him I didn't feel triumphant, the way some younger version of myself might have imagined feeling, sitting awake at 3 in the morning weeks earlier turning the math over and over. I felt something quieter than triumph, something closer to completion, the particular stillness that arrives after you've finally set down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying with both arms for almost 4 decades. My father hadn't transformed. He likely never would, not fully, not into the version of himself who stands up at a podium and says he was wrong, because that has never been who he is, and some part of loving someone honestly means accepting the shape of who they actually are instead of who you needed them to be. But something between us had shifted its footing, and shifted footing, I have learned, is sometimes the most honest kind of change available between two people who have spent decades standing on the wrong ground together. I thought, on that drive, about my grandfather, though he had nothing to do with this story directly, about the kind of plain, blunt wisdom certain people in a family hand down almost by accident, the kind that ends up outliving them by decades. My father had never given me anything like that, no quiet folder with handwriting on the cover, no single sentence that settled an argument before it started. What he'd given me instead, without meaning to, was the opposite kind of inheritance, the long practice of building my own ground to stand on precisely because he had never once offered me his. I am not certain, even now, whether that makes him a worse father than the ones who hand their children something soft to land on, or simply a different kind of teacher, one who taught by omission instead of instruction. I have decided, for my own peace, not to spend the rest of my life litigating which one he was. I have decided instead to notice what I built in the space he left empty, and call that, simply, mine. In the months since Easter, things between my father and me have not transformed into anything resembling closeness, the kind you see performed in other families, the kind I sometimes still privately wish for in the quiet, unguarded moments late at night when old wounds resurface regardless of how much progress you've made on top of them. He has not, as I write this, ever said the word sorry about the retirement party, not directly, not in the specific shape I once imagined wanting. But he has stopped telling the story about talking the mortgage company into a deal, at least in front of me, and my mother tells me, in her careful second-hand way, that he stopped telling it to others too. The story simply quietly retired, the way certain stories are when the person telling them realizes, somewhere private and unspoken, that they no longer hold up. He has, twice now, asked me real questions about the company, the kind of question that requires actually wanting to know the answer rather than performing polite interest while waiting for his turn to talk again. Small things. How many people we employ now? Whether the software does what I once tried, badly, to explain to him at a holiday dinner years ago when he'd nodded along without listening. They are not large gestures. I have stopped needing them to be large to notice that they exist at all, which is, I think, its own kind of growth, the willingness to register small honest things instead of waiting for grand ones that may never come. Adrian and I have never spoken about that Easter dinner as some kind of business triumph, because it never was one, and treating it that way would have cheapened what it actually cost both of us to sit inside it. The fund continued exactly as it always had, restructuring notes fairly, foreclosing only when every other option had genuinely failed, my father's loan simply one file among hundreds, indistinguishable in process from any other family's, which was, in the end, the entire point. I did not want my father saved by favoritism. I wanted him saved by the same decency that should exist for everyone, and I wanted him, eventually, to understand exactly where that decency had come from, not as leverage, but as a fact he could no longer avoid looking at. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have learned, the hard way, that there usually is one buried somewhere even in the messiest family stories, it is something close to what I told my father at that table, stripped down to its plainest form. You can spend a lifetime deciding what someone is worth, standing at a podium, holding a microphone, certain that your verdict is the only one that counts. But worth has a way of getting built quietly, in rooms you're not standing in, by people you've already stopped watching closely enough to notice. And sometimes, if you're patient, and if you're lucky enough to have someone beside you who learned the same hard lessons in a different house, the truth finds its own way back to the table, without you ever having to raise your voice to get it there. If you've ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to believe in you first, and built something real anyway, in the quiet, unwatched hours nobody gave you credit for, let this be your sign that the math eventually evens out, even when you're not the one keeping score. Tell me in the comments where you finally let your own worth speak louder than someone else's verdict. And if this reached you, subscribe and stay with us. To round out the full count cleanly, in the years since, I've come to think less about that banquet hall and more about the quiet, ordinary Tuesdays that followed it, the ones where nothing dramatic happened at all, where my father simply asked a normal question about my work and I simply answered it, and we moved on to the next ordinary thing without either of us needing the moment to mean more than it did. That, I have decided, is what repair actually looks like in families that were never built for grand reconciliations. Not a single perfect scene. 100 small, unremarkable ones, stacked quietly on top of the one big scene that finally cracked the old story open. I'll take that. I'll take it gladly. Every ordinary Tuesday it keeps arriving.